Hello folks and welcome back to Skybound on the Ground with Michael Lombard. My name is Michael Lombard. I introduced you to the dark side of lift last lesson, and namely that nasty little habit that lift has of producing induced drag when you're flying the wing at high angles of attack. We also learned about how drag, whether it's from induced drag at low airspeeds, high angles of attack, or parasite drag at high airspeeds, drag is here to stay with us and there's no way we can get away from it. But I was just about to get to the point where I'm going to tell you about a very special place where drag doesn't have nearly as much effect, nearly as much tyrannical power on you as it normally does. So, let's get to it. By the way, today's lesson is based on the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, Chapter 4, Aerodynamics. We've been going through this step by step, and this is the second in the Aerodynamics series. So, we learned about how flying over the wings is how we produce lift. And you get the airflow pattern going, and remember you get upwash and downwash and wingtip vortices going on. Well, this very special place where drag isn't produced as much by the airplane is close to the ground. As close to the ground as you can get. And that is called ground effect. And what do you know? And that is very interesting. Without going into a detailed engineering explanation of why this happens, because I can't give that kind of an explanation, we're just going to show you what happens. As the airplane comes close to the ground's surface actually interferes with the airflow pattern that has been established over the wing. And so what happens is you get less upwash, you get less downwash, you get less strong wingtip vortices. Those aren't able to be produced as well. And you know what else you get less of? You get less drag. And so suddenly the airplane wing is a lot more efficient as it gets close to the ground because the ground is interfering with that airflow pattern. Now the wing is going to produce more lift for a lower airspeed at a lower angle of attack with less drag penalty. It's like, wow, what more could he ask for? This is amazing. All this free stuff. Well, it's amazing if you were expecting it, but this can actually sneak up on you unawares if you're not careful. So let's see how this can happen. Let's say you decided to skip ground school class and not learn about what we're learning today, and actually just go out and fly the airplane. So you decide to go flying, and it's time to come back to the airport. We're just going to let's put some trees over here, beautify the airport. They always seem to put trees at the very end of the runway, don't they? So we're flying down final approach here, or you are, I should say, and you weren't paying attention to your approach speed, and you're carrying in a few extra knots, so you're coming in hot and fast. But hey, no problem. As soon as you level off over the runway, you just pull the power to idle, and that should slow the airplane down, shouldn't it? Well, you have now arrived in that wonderful zone where you have ground effect going on. Ground effect is most noticed when the airplane comes within one wingspan's height of the ground. So if you would take the wing of the airplane and measure that between where the airplane is and the ground, when you come within one wingspan, that's where you start noticing ground effect the most. You have arrived in ground effect. And now that extra speed that you're carrying is going to start producing more lift. The airplane is not going to have as much drag to help it slow down. The airplane wing is going to be producing more lift with less drag being produced, a lower angle of attack, and you're going to need less airspeed to sustain the airplane in level flight. So instead of the airplane wanting to land, because each landing is basically a controlled stall the last few inches into the ground, the airplane is just going to keep on wanting to fly. And so it floats and floats and floats, and oh no, there are trees up the end of the runway, and we can't just force the airplane onto the ground because it'll just bounce right back up, and then you'll get this bad pilot-induced oscillation going on. It can break the airplane. But uh-oh, there are trees at the end of the runway, and we end up breaking our airplane anyway because we couldn't get our plane slowed down enough. You were experiencing ground effect, where the airplane where the wing is suddenly a lot more efficient, and you have less drag, you produce more lift at lower airspeeds, and at and lower angle of attack. Same thing can also happen when you are trying to take off, except you experience the reverse of it. In this case, the airplane wouldn't stop flying, and when you're trying to take off, you want to fly, but you might not be able to get the airplane to fly if you don't have enough airspeed. So you decided to skip ground school class again, and you go up to Lake Tahoe and rent an airplane up there. And it's a hot summer day, so you have high temperatures, high altitudes. The air is not very thick right now. And you fire up the engine and start going along the runway, and you realize that this airplane is going it's taking a really long time to accelerate. It's acting really sluggishly, and that's because the air is just not thick enough for the engine to do its normal job, not thick enough for the wings to produce enough lift, and so it is taking a long time for this airplane to accelerate, and you're not sure if it's going to ever reach flying speed. You have gone across the runway, and now, oh no, there's trees at the end of the runway again. So what are we going to do? Well, you could just pull back the power and stop the airplane and go call it a day. But no, we're not going to do that. You need to try to get that airplane in the air. So what you do, even though the airplane doesn't have the speed that you're supposed to have to take off, you decide desperate situations call for drastic measures. So you pull back on the controls and bring that airplane up into the air. And you think, today we are going to cheat gravity, aerodynamics, and everybody else. But the airplane only gets like 3 or 4 feet off the ground. And what was happening is that because you are in ground effect, that wing is going to produce more lift at lower airspeeds. And so you are able to actually get the airplane off the ground, but only a few feet off the ground, because once you start climbing out of ground effect, you're going to need more airspeed in order to sustain the airplane, because the wing won't be producing as much lift. You're going to have a higher angle of attack. And then plus, as you get out of ground effect, your wing starts producing more drag. And so even though you manage to get 3 or 4 feet off the ground, you start pulling the airplane more, you start pulling the airplane higher, and as it climbs out of ground effect, suddenly you start increasing all that drag, and you start feeling it. And what happens is the airplane settles, and it starts going back down towards the runway. And you try to fight it, and you're just flying along, just a few feet off the runway, and oh no, there's those trees again. So this is something you have to be aware of when you're flying airplanes, and that's why it takes training once again. And that's also why we learn about stuff like ground effect. Ground effect can actually be used in your advantage, though, if you're careful. Let's say we don't have to worry about space here, and we have all the space that we need to work with. And but this is a very rough runway, and so we are going along in our airplane, and it's a super rough runway, and you're bouncing along, and you don't want to take the time to accelerate all the way up to flying speed, and in the meantime be rattling your teeth loose. And so what you're going to do is you're going to actually pull the airplane off the ground, just like we did up at Lake Tahoe, before it's ready to fly. But then you're not going to try to climb out. You're just going to fly along just a few feet off the ground in ground effect, and that'll be your effective runway. It'll be like you're going down the runway, and you're just going to speed up in ground effect and get your flying speed, and then climb out. And so that is actually it's called the soft field takeoff technique, which you're going to be practicing later on. And that's how you get off soft runways that are trying to slow you down, or really rough runways. So ground effect can be used to your advantage, and ground effect is a pretty neat thing. And too bad we don't fly right next to the ground for the whole flight, because then we could save gas and who knows what. But there might be things you run into. Anyway, so that's ground effect, and we're going to now move on to something else that's pretty interesting, namely the fact that airplanes know how to fly better than you do. Really, how does that work? Well, obviously it's not because the airplane has some sort of innate intelligence. But that's because there was an intelligent designer who made that airplane. I wonder how that works in terms of humans. Anyway, moving along here. So airplanes are inherently, most airplanes that you're going to fly, especially in your training, are going to know how to fly better than you do. And that's because of this characteristic called stability. Stability is the inherent characteristic of an airplane that it wants to return back to its original flight path after something disturbs it. Perhaps there was a gust of wind, or perhaps you bumped the controls. If the airplane is stable, it's going to want to return back to its original position, or its original attitude. And let's define attitude here. Attitude is not your state of mind, but it's actually your relationship to the horizon. It's a spatial term. Okay, so the airplane is going to want to return to its original attitude if it gets disturbed. That is called stability. Airplanes are also designed to be, there's different degrees of maneuverability. That's how well the airplane, that's the quality that allows the airplane to be maneuvered easily and withstand stresses. So if you've got a aerobatic airplane, it's very maneuverable. This is not an aerobatic airplane. Controllability is how well the airplane actually responds to control inputs. These are all affected by that one characteristic of stability. Stability is the key to how the airplane knows how to fly better than you do. And let's take a look at stability. Here's what you got: two different types of stability. You have what's called static stability, and that's what happens immediately after that first change takes place. And so what we're going to do, we're going to take our airplane up, and we're going to imagine that this is our training airplane, our Cessna 172. We're going to take it up to 5,000 feet and set it up for level flight. And then we're going to do a little experiment here and see how stable this airplane is. So we're up here cruising, and now what we're going to do, we're just going to take our controls, push forward to get that nose down, and then just let go. And we're going to see what happens. Sounds fun? Okay, let's do that. So we're not going to push forward super hard. You're not going to get, you're not going to see your breakfast again. But so we push the airplane forward, and we're going to see what happens. So the nose is down now. We've let go of the controls, and what happens to the airplane? If it's stable, it's going to want to pick its nose back up to where it was before. That is called positive static stability. The immediate reaction of the plane is to return back to its original flight attitude. Okay, so what happens if the airplane, we push forward on the controls, we let go, the airplane just keeps pointing down? That is called neutral static stability, because the immediate reaction of the airplane is, I don't care, I'm just going to keep pointing in whatever direction I got bumped into. Okay, we should be more proactive than that. Well, what happens if the airplane keeps on going down more and more and more? That is called neutral static stability, and that is called negative static stability, and that is definitely a negative situation that we don't want to experience. Okay, so that's static stability. That is what happens immediately after the airplane experiences that disturbing force. What happens in a little bit of time afterwards is what is called dynamic stability. So what tends to happen is when the airplane, if it has positive static stability and it comes back, it wants to bring the nose back up, what will tend to happen is the airplane will actually overshoot. It'll overcorrect, and so it'll come up a little bit higher than when it was before. But the tendency is to keep on correcting and eventually get back to where it was, the level flight attitude. That is what you call positive dynamic stability. And if we look at it, if we draw a chart of that, here's what happens. So these things keep on getting smaller and smaller and smaller until finally the airplane is flying level again. If the airplane doesn't care about what's happening, even though it has positive static stability, normally it will want to pick its nose back up again, but then it keeps on overshooting and undershooting and just keeps on going back and forth without any change in the amplitude. That is what you call neutral dynamic stability. And the airplane is just going to keep on doing that indefinitely. Okay, we have one more situation, and you can imagine what this is going to be like. So the airplane, we push forward on the nose, let go of the controls, nose comes back up, and overshoots and goes back down, and it keeps on getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and oh, hold on to your seatbelts, folks. Yeah, okay, that is what you call whoops, we're going in the wrong direction here. Anyway, it works the same way if you pick up the nose and let go of the controls. And so this is what you call negative dynamic stability. And once again, that's a negative situation. We want to be positive, folks. Okay, so how in the world does an airplane even know how to do this? It doesn't have a brain, does it? Well, no, it actually, but it doesn't have a brain, but it's just all about how it's all about airspeed, how the air is flowing over the wings. So let's take a look at how that works. Okay, so you and I are going to figure out how we're going to design our airplane. So here is our airplane, and this is one of those Cessnas with a high wing on it. Okay, so there's some considerations that we have to think about here, and first one is, well, we have our center of pressure, and that's basically the place where the low pressure is centered on the wing. That's where the lift is being concentrated. And if you were to dangle the airplane on a point, that's where you were dangling the airplane from, the center of pressure. So we need to figure out where are we going to have the center of gravity of the airplane be. Because we're dangling the airplane, we want to have it be nice and balanced, right? So, what do you say? Let's put the center of gravity right underneath the center of pressure, because wouldn't that mean the airplane would be perfectly balanced? Wrong. That is a bad idea, and let me show you why. When you have the airplane flying at a higher angle of attack, what's going to happen is, yeah, that's a little bit of an excessive angle of attack, okay, so we have our center of gravity. It was right underneath the center of pressure, but when you increase the angle of attack of the airplane, the center of pressure moves forward on the wing. And so now you have your center of pressure ahead of the center of gravity. And if you're dangling it like this, if it was perfectly balanced first like that, and then you move it like that, the airplane is just going to want to keep on flipping. And so the airplane is actually going to be inherently unstable. Anything that disturbs it from that original position is going to tend to propagate itself, and it's just going to keep on going. Not a good situation. So we need to rethink our design. We're going to we'll just look at how airplane designers actually did it. And you know where they put the center of gravity? They put it in front. They figured out the point where the center of pressure is not going to go past when you're flying the airplane and its range of angles of attack. And they put the center of gravity in front of that point. So you're never going to have the problem of the center of pressure of that point where you're holding the airplane from. You're never going to have the problem of that getting in front of the center of gravity. But now you have the problem that the airplane is always going to be nose heavy. What are we going to do about that? Because we want to fly at that airplane. We don't want to have it always pitching down. Well, we have something in the back here. And that is called the horizontal stabilizer. And you know what the horizontal stabilizer is? It's actually a little wing. That's exactly what it is. And what we've done, what the airplane designers have done, is put that actually at a negative angle of attack. And so we have our weight that's pulling the airplane down on the front. And what they do is they make this wing in the back actually fly downwards. It produces this downwards aerodynamic force. And that is how we balance the airplane. That is pretty cool. And it also acts like a cruise control. Because what happens is when you're flying along, and if you're flying along at, say, 100 knots, you have the air flowing over the wings, you have the air flowing over the tail wing right here, over the horizontal stabilizer. If you somehow pull back the throttle, and you don't touch the control, you don't do anything to the controls, but you pull back the throttle, the plane's going to start slowing down a little bit, right? And then you get less air flowing over the wings. You also have less of the downwash from this upper wing hitting the down wing. And so this force back here is going to become less. So instead of the airplane being balanced like it was before, it's going to want to pitch down because the wing is not doing enough of its job in the back here because you don't have enough air flowing over it. So the airplane is going to pitch down and it's going to start picking up speed again. And what happens is then the airflow is restored over the tail, and then you get enough air flowing over to get that aerodynamic downforce restored again, and then the airplane once again gets back into its stabilized flight, this time in a descent, but still at 100 knots. So that's cool. And then the same thing actually applies for if you're going to pick the airplane up into a climb. We're not going to touch the controls. We're just going to put the throttle forward, all the way forward. And so what happens, the airplane starts speeding up. You get more airflow, more downwash over this back wing here. And that wing is going to produce more aerodynamic force. So the tail goes down, the nose goes up, and the airplane starts climbing. Of course, it's probably going to overshoot, and it's going to get to about maybe 95 or 90 knots and get a little bit too slow. And so then you get less air flowing over the tail, and then so the tail will come up a little bit, and the nose will go down, and then it'll do that little oscillation, and then finally get established back into a steady state climb at 100 knots. And that is how our cruise control system works. So pretty cool, huh? By the way, I need to mention one more term that we use when we talk about stuff. When we talk about the airplane's tendency to rotate about its center of gravity, we call that tendency a moment. So a moment is the result of multiplying force by the distance away from the center of gravity. So you get, when you have a pitching moment, it's the tendency of the airplane to pitch around to pitch. When you have a rolling moment, it's the tendency, how much tendency the airplane has to roll. So you'll run into that term more as we talk more about when we get into like center of gravity, weight and balance discussions later on. Alright, so we have been talking about, this has all been about longitudinal stability. It's the stability of the airplane. The airplane pitches around its lateral axis, and we call that longitudinal stability. Okay, so now let's talk about how the airplane is stable along its longitudinal axis. We call that lateral stability. Wouldn't it be nice if the airplane was laterally stable, just as it is longitudinally stable? Well, I think it would be. And let's see how we can do that. Okay, let's take a look at the airplane from the front. Now, if you have wings that are just pointing straight out like this, okay, we have wings that are pointing, we can have wings that are pointing just straight out like this, or we can take the wings and we can bend them upwards. That's a little bit of an exaggeration. Most airplanes don't have wings that are bent up that much, unless you've been out doing excessive aerobatics. But this is called dihedral, and that's the amount of bend that the wing has. Dihedral is what we use to make an airplane more stable, more laterally stable. And let me show you how that works. If you bump the airplane and get it into a bank, what happens is the airplane will be in this bank. It'll actually start side slipping a little bit, and that side slip is what we take advantage of when we use the dihedral. So look at the airplane in its side slip. If we just have a regular plane, that's our regular plane without any dihedral. When you're moving any direction, you're going to have a little bit of breeze coming at you from that direction, right? We call that relative wind. So you can have a little bit of sideways relative wind that way. If you have dihedral, you can actually take advantage of that side slipping, the relative wind from that, and what happens is that the relative wind is going to hit the lower wing at a higher angle of attack than the relative wind that hits the upper wing. And what happens when you have higher angle of attack? You get more lift, exactly. So the airplane is actually going to want to roll itself back level. And that is how dihedral gives us lateral stability. We also have this wonderful thing in the back called the vertical stabilizer, the tail fin of the airplane. That kind of acts like a keel on a boat, and that helps keep the airplane laterally stable. And if you have the center of gravity below that, it'll also kind of act like a pendulum. And so that is the keel effect and the center of gravity and stuff. That helps keep the airplane upright and keep it from getting upset. And that is how lateral stability is. We have one more axis that we need to talk about, and that is vertical stability around the vertical axis. The airplane yaws left and right. Now, don't ask me why we call longitudinal stability when it's around the lateral axis, and lateral stability around the longitudinal axis, and vertical stability around the vertical axis. Just write them down and memorize them. Anyway, so the airplane will be, if you have vertical stability around the vertical axis, it's going to, if it gets pushed a little bit to the side, it's going to want to return back and align itself. And you've actually seen devices like this, and it might not be in what you expect, but you'll have seen it on top of a barn. So, what do you have, a rooster or something? Maybe it might have been an airplane, but on top of this little pole, and when the wind blows, oh, okay, it gets aligned with the wind. It's a weather vane, and when you have the airplane, the vertical stability of the airplane is actually the easiest thing to design because you have the body of the airplane. So anytime the airplane starts going a little bit sideways, you're going to have the breeze hitting that side, and it's going to want to push the airplane back and align itself into the breeze. And we also, the reason why we put the tail fin in the back is if we put it in the front, it would actually swap ends and it would be flying, it would want to go backwards. Planes don't fly backwards very well. So we have to make sure that we have most of the surface area that we're working on behind the pivot point, in this case the center of gravity. So that is vertical stability. Okay, we have been talking about how stable airplanes are. There is one feature that most airplanes have that is a type of instability, and that is called spiral instability. So we saw how dihedral helps the airplane roll itself back level if it gets disturbed. We also saw how the tail fin of the airplane and just the body of the airplane helps the airplane keep flying straight if it gets disturbed sideways. Well, what happens is when if the airplane does get into, say, a good-sized bank right here, and it starts getting that side-slipping effect, well, the dihedral might not work fast enough. It might not do its job quickly enough. And so as the airplane is going a little bit sideways, now the wind is coming at it from the side, and it's going to want to align itself into the wind. It's going to weather vane. So what happens? The airplane pivots like this, and as that happens, the outboard wing slices through the air quicker, and it produces more lift, and so it tends to pick up the outboard wing even more, and the nose is pointing down now because the airplane kind of rotated into that nose down position, and that just keeps on getting worse and worse and worse, and the airplane starts getting in a spiral, a downward spiral. That is spiral instability. And this is exactly what happens to pilots when they fly into the clouds and they don't know how to fly on instruments and they lose control of the airplane. You've probably heard of the graveyard spiral. This is what happens. And something interesting is that the airplane, when the wreckage is discovered and investigators put the pieces back together and reconstruct the story, they actually often find out that the airplane did not come apart just on the ground, but it was actually pulled apart in the air. And that is something that we're going to figure out how that happens on the next lesson, and how load factors affect an airplane's flight, and how we can actually do our best to keep our airplanes together in the sky so that they will serve us for many more years. So, tune in next time. We'll be wrapping up the chapter on aerodynamics next time on Skybound on the Ground.